1938, a Polish Jew named Zindel Greenspan was rousted from his home by Nazi police, disposed of everything, driven across the German border, and incarcerated in the stable of a military camp. He was one of 12,000 Jews who had been beaten and deported. Still, he managed to let his son know what was happening. The angry son took a gun to the German embassy in Paris. Planning to shoot the ambassador, he ended up shooting a different diplomat named Ernst von Roth instead. Now, in the meantime, Adolf Hitler was upset with the passivity of the German people. He felt he needed a crisis to wake people up. And a Jew shooting a German diplomat in Paris, France, provided just that crisis. Joseph Goebbels, Nazi propaganda chief, arranged anti-Jewish demonstrations to be held all over the nation. And on November 9th, 1938, the following order was sent to all police stations, and I quote, "At very short notice, actions against Jews, especially against their synagogues, will take place through the whole of Germany. They are not to be hindered. Preparations are to be made to arrest 20 to 30,000 Jews, wealthy Jews in particular." Well, that night, riots inflamed Germany. So many windows were shattered that the night became known as Kristallnacht, the night of shattering glass. 76 synagogues were destroyed, another 200 set on fire, thousands of homes and shops were burned down, 20,000 Jews were arrested. And Adolf Hitler had both his crisis and his scapegoat. Onto the Jews, he heaped all the blame for Germany's economic problems. And people accepted that. And we all know of the Holocaust that followed. Today it's refugees and immigrants in our world who are being scapegoats for all the economic and social problems everywhere. There are 65 million refugees throughout the world. They are mostly fleeing from war and famine, with as many as 65% of them children. In addition, there are millions of immigrants simply seeking a better life in a different country. And both immigrants and refugees face hostility in many, many places. Here in the United States, we continue the conflicting tradition of hospitality on the one hand and hostility toward the stranger on the other. As Benjamin Franklin noted, America has hailed newcomers to its shores as the bulwark of democracy. However, in times of crisis, it has also used the foreign-born as scapegoat for unsolved social problems. Interesting to note, for the first 100 years of the United States' existence, we welcomed immigrants with open arms. In 1819, Congress encouraged immigration by setting standards for passenger ships to make the voyage to America more comfortable. Only after the frontier was settled in the late 1800s did limits on immigration begin. Ironically, it was just as the Statue of Liberty in 1886 began welcoming immigrants into New York's harbor that the United States began turning them away. The first immigration limits applied to types of people, not numbers. In 1875, Congress said no to immigration for convicts and prostitutes. In 1882, pressures of racism led to the Chinese Exclusionary Act. And even as playwright Israel Zangwill in 1908 coined the phrase melting pot for the United States, Congress kept adding to the excluded list: paupers, polygamists, epileptics, and the mentally ill. In a Time survey a number of years ago, most Americans thought that immigration was a good thing in our past. It helped make who we are. But over 70% of the people in that survey said immigration was a bad thing now. In case you were wondering about the title of my sermon, Philoxenia. In the Bible, the word for hospitality in the Greek is philoxenia. Philo, meaning love, and xenia, meaning the stranger, love of the stranger. That's hospitality. Hospitality in the Bible is less about entertaining friends and more about welcoming the outsider, making room at the table for those who haven't belonged before. As you might imagine, an enemy to philoxenia is xenophobia, the fear of the stranger. In the Old Testament, we read of God leading the Israelites out of exile. When God finally brings these immigrant people to the promised land, he gives them all kinds of instruction of how they are to behave, how they're supposed to worship, how they're supposed to set up their society, and how they're supposed to organize, and especially how they are to care for the stranger in their land. I think as you look over the two texts that were read this morning, three things come to mind. First point about how to care for strangers in the land is to love and like them. In Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 18, it states, God defends the case and cause of the fatherless and the widow. He loves the immigrant and he loves the alien, and you are to love the immigrant and alien too. And then God says, love them because you once were an immigrant in the land of Egypt. Then in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 34, the alien living with you must be treated as one of your native born. Get that? Must be treated the same as a native born person. Love him as yourself. Kind of sounds like the golden rule, doesn't it? Love your neighbor as yourself. Love the outsider. The second point gives justice to outsiders. Deuteronomy chapter 24, God says, do not deprive the alien or the fatherless of justice. Truth is, immigrants and refugees are not exactly in the strongest position to advocate for laws for themselves. Their focus is often just on survival, not on advocacy or changing laws. This means our job is advocacy. Our job is to speak up. Our job is to make sure that the alien is not deprived of justice. So this falls on us, doesn't it? In fact, God goes so far in Deuteronomy chapter 27, verse 19, to say, cursed is the man, and I would guess or woman, cursed is the person who withholds justice from the alien. And then third, we're to care for strangers in the land by providing them food, by providing basic needs. Leviticus chapter 23, verse 22 talks about when you reap your harvest, don't reap to the very edge of your field. Leave some around the edges of your harvest so the poor and immigrants and the alien can come in and get food. In ancient Israel, it was clear that the wealth they had was God's wealth, meant to be shared with the poor, with strangers, with immigrants, with migrants in their midst. Now think about it. Can you imagine a large corporate American farm inviting immigrants from, say, Mexico to share in the harvest? Or Nordstrom's holding back a portion of their fall collection to give to recent immigrants from Haiti? Truth is, this biblical stuff is challenging. It's not easy. And it often doesn't mesh with our 21st century affluent lifestyle. The biblical mandate, certainly out of ancient Israel, is clear. Accept, and even more than accept, care for the foreigners or strangers in your midst. And then, of course, there's Jesus himself. Jesus saw no difference between people, Greeks, Romans, Samaritans, Jews. It didn't matter. Now think about Jesus, the immigrant refugee child. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph fled political violence like so many refugees have done before and do today. They crossed borders without travel documents. They sought safety. They sought sanctuary after Herod said that he would kill all those 2 years and younger to keep his kingdom safe. No, Jesus, Joseph, and Mary simply crossed the border and found sanctuary in a foreign land. And when they finally arrive in Egypt, although they are strangers, someone must have taken them in. Someone must have welcomed them and helped them. Biblical scholars say that they were there in Egypt for 3 years. Don't you wish we knew who the person was that took in Jesus and Mary and Joseph? Then I wonder if Joseph, who was a carpenter, when he started looking for work, I wonder if there were carpenters there in Egypt that said, "Oh, look out, here comes that foreigner. He's going to take away jobs that really we Egyptians should be doing." Or, well, here's Mary and that baby. I wonder if that woman and child are going to be a burden on our welfare system. See, that family, they just do things differently than we do. Makes you wonder why it is we so often struggle with questions like these. And then we have our text from Matthew 25, where we are told we'll be judged not on our church attendance, not on how many nightly prayers we do or daily Bible reading, but it says we're going to be judged on how we feed the hungry, give water to the thirsty, welcome the stranger, clothe the naked, care for the sick, visit the prisoner. When you find yourself doing something for the immigrant, feeding a hungry person, visiting a sick person, practicing hospitality, you're showing that you belong to Jesus. And Jesus lists activities that are accessible to pretty much everyone in the world. You don't need special training to feed someone who is hungry. You don't need a seminary degree on your wall or a year of leadership training to feed a hungry person. You just need to have a lunch and be willing to give it away. It's pretty simple. You got a lunch, you see someone who's hungry, you give them your lunch. No training class in the church is needed for that. You don't need to be a millionaire or to get a grant to go into McDonald's, for example, and purchase a couple burgers for a man who is standing on the street, hungry. You don't need amazing spiritual gifts to sit with someone in a hospital room who is sick. Anyone of any age can visit with an elderly relative in a nursing home. You can even be a 3-year-old and visit your great-grandmother. You don't need a PhD to visit a prisoner. Truth is, one day we're going to stand before Jesus, our judge, and we will have to account for the grace we claim was at work in our lives. And at that time, Jesus is going to ask for evidence of his grace. Well, this is helpful to know, but Christians, as Christians, the primary reason we are to love immigrants is not just because we fear being judged. As people of God, we love because God loved us first. As people of God, we love because of philoxenia, love of the stranger. We love because God tells us, make room at your table for the outsider. And remember, as people who affirm human compassion, advocate for human rights, and seek justice, we must never make the mistake of confusing a legal right with a moral right. The forced removal of Native Americans from their land and onto reservations was legal. The importation of African slaves and sale of the same was legal. South African apartheid was legal. The confiscation of the property of Jews at the beginning of the Nazi regime was legal. The Spanish Inquisition was legal. Crucifying Jesus was legal. The fact that something is legal does not cut much ethical ice. The powerful have always used the legal system to oppress the powerless. It's true, as citizens, we should respect the rule of law. More importantly, though, our duty is to create laws founded on our highest sense of justice, equity, and compassion. Loud voices urge us to choose fear, denial, reactionary nationalism, and racism. We must stand up, resist, and choose the better way. We must choose the path of compassion and hope. We must choose a path that is founded on the recognition that we are connected, that we are all in this together. Now, all that being said, I'll be the first to admit that I certainly don't have all the answers for policy on immigration or the related issues of public education, healthcare, and the economy. But I do know this. Breaking up working poor families who have lived among us for years does not feel like justice, equity, and compassion in action. Refusing minimal health services to young children does not feel like the way we should treat members of the human family. Having our police profile brown people does not feel like breaking down the walls of tribalism. Creating a huge wall, complete with barbed wire, across 100 miles of border does not seem very neighborly. There must be a better way. And you and I are the ones who are going to have to build it. Barbed wire, you see, is not the answer. More border guards and more deportations are not the answer. Paranoia and panic will solve nothing. We must remember that we all come from immigrant stock. Every single one of us living on this continent. Even Native Americans at one time immigrated from Asia. We need not be afraid of a multicultural society, because you see, fear leads to violence. Fear leads to oppression. Instead, we are invited by God, by Jesus, to embrace the possibilities before us, to be guided by love and hope. In a day of scapegoating and of fear of what to me is clearly racist immigrant bashing, I think we need a deeper vision, a deeper hope. We must defy logic and reason and realism in order to declare ourselves a haven for economic and political refugees alike. Remember that symbolic imagery of Jesus, that on the final day, God will ask each of us, when was I hungry and you fed me? When was I thirsty and you gave me a drink? When was I naked and I clothed you? When was I a stranger and you welcomed me? The Spirit of God dwells in each person seeking to cross our border, whether from Mexico or Haiti or Syria or Vietnam. Do we dare look upon these strangers and not welcome them? But we must remember, truly I say to you, just as you did or did not do one of these things to the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you did or did not do to me. Amen.